his thoughts on the signs of the times.
Right, well, thanks very much, Phil. I'm going to try and just share my screen. So give me just a second while I do this. See how we get on. Share. Right, for those of you who are unmuted, Phil, can you, or Luke, can you see?
We can see that, yeah. This is Bible prophecy. There's various people on the front.
Perfect, lovely, that's good. So that's operational. So, well, it's lovely to be with you. I know we were just saying a few minutes ago that, you know, it's not ideal, is it, the world in which we suddenly find ourselves? I mean, it's amazing. You know, this time last year when we were doing a prophecy review of 2019, none of us had any idea, as Phil kindly pointed out, that just a few weeks down the line after the prophecy review we did last year, our whole world was going to change so dramatically. Who would have possibly thought that ecclesias would have stopped meeting face to face and that we'd end up in the world in which we're in? And not just, you know, one country, not just Europe, but the entire planet, as we know, has been impacted. So it goes to show you don't really want to make too many predictions looking forward. And I think, you know, for me, when you're thinking about prophecy, it isn't so much trying to say what's going to happen. Yes, there's big pictures that we can see and we know the direction of travel. But really, for me, the wonder of prophecy is actually looking back and seeing God's hand fulfilling things rather than trying to second guess all the things that might happen going forwards. And I think one of the reasons that clearly God has given us prophecy is to help strengthen our faith. I don't know if you'd agree with that, but to me, he didn't have to put any prophecy in the Bible. He could have left it all out and given us his whole plan and purpose really without the detail of prophecy that he's given us. And as I say, I think the reason he's given us this a huge amount of prophecy in the Bible is to help those to watch and to be ready for when Jesus gets back. Now, what I normally do, and I'll try and do it again right now, is play a short video from a news organization that in about 90 seconds does a sort of an overview of the previous year. So this is a 2020 sort of little video from a news organization. I think it's an Australian news organization giving a recap of 2020. It's totally unedited. This is how they saw 2020. Hopefully you can see this and hear it okay.
Violence has flared on the streets of the US. I can't breathe.
We cannot put Queenslanders at risk.
Right here, right now, Australians dealing with some of the hardest times in their lives. The drought that has gone on for years, bushfires, recent times, COVID-19.
We are in a pandemic. It's life and death. You might forego your own safety.
Do you accept any responsibility for any breaches?
471 new cases in Victoria.
He can't answer questions about hotel quarantine because there's an inquiry.
Australia's not a
The US is in the grip of widespread...
Protesters are refusing to move back.
When does this violence end?
I am your president of law and order.
Down, down, down.
The worst bushfire crisis in the state's history.
House after house after house, gone.
The sky looking as apocalyptic as the...
We knew the president was unpredictable.
This is a case where they're trying to steal an
The president
election.
has lashed out.
It's a winner-takes-all play.
Let's remain calm, patient, as we count all the votes.
Joe Biden's really trying to play this cautiously.
Networks don't get to decide elections.
The Democrat becomes America's 46th president.
Let's give each other a chance. and to make America respected around the world again.
It's sort of like watching a disaster movie, isn't it? When you see some of the things that we've been able to see in the world around us. I mean, it's incredible. I mean, even tonight, protesters are storming Congress. President Trump has called for, really has been calling for violence and an uprising against the US elections there. You've got the number one superpower in the world in the grips of, you know, real political turmoil, and we're going to consider some of that this evening. So what are we going to look at? Because there's just so much going on. There always is, but there's more than ever this year. To me, it's sort of, when you look at prophecy, it's like a gigantic sort of jigsaw puzzle. There's many chapters. There's many verses in the Bible that talk about events of the last days, and it's quite a complex picture. And what I've found is, the more I've looked at it, the more you realize that one part of the jigsaw puzzle impacts another part of the jigsaw puzzle. And so an event happening in America could impact an event over in the Middle East, and which in turn impacts Russia, which in turn impacts the EU. And all of these pieces of this amazing jigsaw puzzle, or chessboard, you might say, are all moving around. So we're going to try and piece all this together and show how one thing is impacting another, and how all of it is sort of reaching a really major conclusion. And the conclusion, of course, is all nations coming against Israel to battle and heralding the return of the Lord Jesus Christ himself. So here's some of the things that we're going to look at in this prophetical jigsaw puzzle. We're going to have a look at coronavirus just for a minute, but not for too long. You'll be glad to know, Helen. Abraham Accords, the Gulf states, Iran, Russia, the US elections, Brexit, and what next? And I guess the one thing I would say is that we all look at the Bible through our own eyes, and we all see things from our own perspective, which is why, you know, you can hear many different prophecy talks by different brethren around the world, and they're all different because they'll all see things and approach things in a slightly different way. But what I'm pretty certain of is that all of us with Bible in hand are looking at the same picture. We're just looking at it through different angles. See, the reason I say this is because you might well look at some of these things and have a slightly different take on it, or you might have put up the agenda, other things than I've put on this screen right now. But these are the things that, looking back through all the weekly World Watch slides, that sort of stuck out in my mind. So let's just start thinking a little bit about the coronavirus, and a couple of thoughts from a prophecy point of view right away. And let's just start thinking with the words of Jesus himself.
Then he said to them, "Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes, famines, and pestilences in various places, and fearful events and great signs from heaven. There will be signs in the sun, moon, and stars. On the earth, nations will be in anguish and perplexity at the roaring and tossing of the sea. People will faint from terror, apprehensive of what is coming on the world, for the heavenly bodies will be shaken. At that time, they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. When these things begin to take place, stand up and lift up your heads, because your redemption is drawing near."
So it's interesting that Jesus said that we should look out for famines and pestilence and earthquake. And pestilence isn't a word I think any of us use in everyday language. But of course, when you look at the word pestilence in any dictionary. This is from the Cambridge Dictionary. It says any very serious infectious disease that spreads quickly and kills large numbers of people. So if that isn't a definition of coronavirus, then I don't know what is. So Jesus did warn that we would see these things come to pass. Clearly, none of us had any concept of a disease that would sweep around the world in literally a matter of weeks and sort of cause this total lockdown. And it's interesting, of course, that the word coronavirus comes from the Latin word corona, which is the Latin word meaning crown. And, you know, I think to a great extent, the world at this time is crowned with this disease. And of course, what we're doing is longing for the time when Jesus is going to return and be crowned as the immortal king. And only then will disease be removed. And we know that that time surely is fast approaching. This cannot be anything other than an enormous sign to us that we're in the very, very, very last days, and a gigantic warning to each and every one of everyone living on the planet that time is nearly up. And of course, it doesn't matter where you live. I did a Bible class just before Christmas and in to Brisbane, and of course they're in exactly the same situation. It doesn't matter where you look in the world, the whole planet is impacted. So I think it's just incredible to see what God is doing. And we might sort of say, and I think Sam mentioned earlier, you know, this isn't a great situation to some extent for brothers and sisters who want to meet together, who want to be in fellowship together, who want to just be together physically at the meeting. But of course, you know, God knows that we're in this situation. He understands it. I don't know whether you think this, but it feels to me a little bit like the Passover, where people had to stay in their homes. And in fact, there's some interesting verses that sort of perhaps even are talking about this situation. In Isaiah 26, verse 20, it says, "Come, my people, enter thou into thy chambers and shut thy doors about thee. Hide thyself, as it were, for a little moment until the indignation be overpast. For behold, the Lord cometh out of his place to punish the inhabitants of the earth for their iniquity. The earth also shall disclose her blood and shall no more cover her slain." And if you read the context of Isaiah 26, it is talking about the last days. It follows on from Isaiah 24, which is talking about the complete financial collapse of the planet. And it sort of culminates in this situation where God's people are having to stay inside and stay with the door shut until the indignation be overpast. Now, this might not be entirely to do with the situation that we're in now. There might be further situations that we have to go through, who knows? But certainly there's an element of this taking place right now. So God knows the situation that we're in. He knows what we're having to go through. And perhaps it's a time for us to prepare, to get ourselves ready, to become more dedicated, more focused on the return of Jesus, because suddenly we can't do the things that we were once doing, herring about the country with, you know, with work or planning holidays, all the things that we might have done. Things have really slowed down, and it's given us time to think. Of course, from the world's point of view, their whole hope, if you like, their faith isn't based on Jesus coming back. It's on a little bottle of vaccine. And of course, I'm not saying vaccines are right or wrong. I mean, people take vaccines all the time, but this is absolutely what the world is banking on solving their problems. And to some extent, of course, it might help. Who knows what's going to happen with this vaccine? But one thing is for certain. I mean, when I talk to people at work and they say, oh, well, this, you know, we've got another 3 or 4 months, then it's all going to be life back to normal. Everything's going to be fine. we're going to have a, go back to basically having a party. But of course, the Bible doesn't say that. It actually says that we're in the time of labor pains. We're in the time of, a pregnancy. It's almost like the world is pregnant, and it's at the very end of the third trimester. You see, I remember that, Ange, the trimesters. So we're almost at the end. We're almost at the time when the world will give birth to the Lord Jesus Christ when he returns. The contractions aren't going to stop. They're just going to get stronger. It's just that we're seeing a huge contraction now, but it's still nothing compared to the contractions that are still to come. I don't think even as yet we've reached the time of trouble such as never was. I think that's still to come. Now, of course, it was on the 31st of January, so literally just a couple of weeks after I did the talk at Malvern last year, when coronavirus was declared a global health emergency by the World Health Organization. And in the weekly World Watch that some of you get, this is what a weekly World Watch slide looks like. Don't worry, I'm not going to read all of that, but it's what it basically does, or what I do each Saturday, is just look at a headline, put the headline on a PowerPoint slide, source it, and then where it's got there, where it says event, that's word for word taken out of the newspaper itself. So this is March the 24th, just 2 months after the World Health Organization had declared it to be a global pandemic. We then saw headlines like this: around 20% of global population under coronavirus lockdown as it began to accelerate. And it wasn't that long when the epicenter shifted from all the way from Wuhan in China all the way across the whole of the world to the other side of the planet, and the epicenter became New York, of all places. So New York is the new virus epicenter as America death toll climbs higher than 9/11. That was on March the 31st. New York has the lion's share of infections in the US, which now has the most cases in the pandemic after eclipsing China last week. And it was almost as if from the east, there was this tsunami wave that passed across the world at incredible speeds and crashed into the coasts of America and brought really unbelievably high figures. And you might well say, well, surely, but it's because America's a big country, so they're bound to have more cases. But that isn't actually true, because when you look at the United States numbers of cases and numbers of deaths, and this is taken from just 2 days ago, I think, the United States has had 20.7 million confirmed coronavirus cases and 352,000 deaths, which accounts for 20%, nearly, just it's a tiny fraction, under 20% of all the deaths in the world have happened in the United States. And yet it only accounts for 4% of the world's population, 20% of the deaths in America, and yet only 4% of the population. America has been substantially hit by this disease, and it's greatly weakened their economy in the process. Now, I want to just take you back to this, because remember I said that coronavirus was declared a global health emergency by the WHO on the 31st of January. But something was going on in America at the very same time that coronavirus was effectively starting and beginning its journey across the world over to America especially, and crashing into its shores. And what actually happened was, and this was during President Trump's impeachment, sorry, it was during his impeachment trial, which was going on in January of 2020, President Trump released his long-awaited Middle East plan. And I just want to play this little clip to you here.
My vision presents a win-win opportunity for both sides, a realistic two-state solution that resolves the risk of Palestinian statehood to Israel's security. Today, Israel has taken a giant step toward peace. This is the first time Israel has authorized the release of a conceptual map illustrating the territorial compromises it's willing to make for the cause of peace, and they've gone a long way. We will also work to create a contiguous territory within the future Palestinian state for when the conditions for statehood are met, including the firm rejection of terrorism. Under this vision, Jerusalem will remain Israel's undivided, very important, undivided capital. This map will more than double the Palestinian territory and provide a Palestinian capital in eastern Jerusalem, where America will proudly open an embassy.
Now, you notice that's quite odd, isn't it? Because one minute he says that Jerusalem will be the undivided capital of Israel, and then in pretty much the next breath says that Eastern Jerusalem will become the Palestinian capital, and America will proudly open an embassy there. And you also notice that he said this is the first time ever that a detailed map of the division of Israel had been put together, and Trump was instrumental in persuading Israel to accept this map. And the Jerusalem Post looked at this and said, this peace plan comes with a map. Why is this significant? And it says at the bottom there, one of the landmarks of US President Donald Trump's diplomatic plan that was introduced Tuesday night is that it presents an actual map, a map that shows how the US administration envisions Israel's final boundaries. This marks the first time any American Middle East plan has come up with a map. Now, you know, this is utterly and completely godless, because what Trump is doing you know, to try and make a deal, or at least what he was trying to do back in January, was to divide God's land. And as we all know, it is the Lord God that has given the land to Israel, and it is not for any world leader to go to the extent of actually dividing it up. And producing a map has gone further than any other world leader has gone at any point in time. And all of this is happening at the very time that coronavirus is beginning its journey to smash into the shores of America. I know it went round the whole world, but no country has been impacted more than the US. And I think we need to remind ourselves of the words from Ezekiel 11, verse 17, that says, "Thus saith the Lord God, I will gather you from the people and assemble you out of the countries where you've been scattered, and I will give you, not half of the land, I will give you the land of Israel." So Trump here is going absolutely foursquare against God himself. In fact, in Zechariah chapter 2, verse 8, it says, "For thus said the Lord of hosts, after his glory sent me to the nations who plundered you," and this is talking about Jerusalem, "for he who touches you touches the apple of his eye. Behold, I will shake my hand over them, and they will become plunder for those who serve them, and then you will know that the Lord of hosts has sent me." And we've talked about this before. I remember showing a similar slide coming up at a previous review of it the last year. But that word apple is not the right word. In the Hebrew, it is the Hebrew word barber, which means something that is hollowed out. And it's talking about the pupil. It's basically saying, when you touch Jerusalem, you are touching the pupil of God's eye. And here is something I think is just amazing, because there is the pupil. The pupil is that dark space next to the number 2 there. So our eye has got a pupil, which is this hollowed out cavity in the eye. But what is really interesting is that covering the eye is this totally transparent, invisible protection called the cornea. It's the only body tissue in the whole of your body with zero blood supply. If there was any blood supply in the cornea, then you wouldn't see clearly. There can't be any blood. And it's the only part of the whole of your body with no blood supply. And that's what makes it completely transparent. And what happens is when you try and touch the pupil of your eye, your finger has to go through the invisible barrier. It goes through the cornea. And what I'm suggesting to you is that Jerusalem, well, I'm not suggesting, the Bible says that the pupil itself is like Jerusalem, and Jerusalem has got an invisible force that is protecting it just exactly like the cornea. And every instinct in your body tells you not to touch the pupil of your eye. If you try and touch your eye right now, every element of your body will say, don't do it. Your mind tells you not to do it. But what President Trump came along and did was to try and divide up Jerusalem and divide God's land in January this year. And as you know, if you touch your eye, you flinch, you blink. And what God is saying is, if you try and touch Jerusalem, I will massively react to that. And I believe that it isn't any coincidence that America is in the turmoil that it's been in this year. It's after its leader went to touch the apple or the pupil of God's eye. And so we saw further headlines coming through. This is from The Guardian on the 18th of July. US faces terrifying autumn as COVID-19 surges. In early June, the United States awoke from a months-long nightmare. Coronavirus had brutalized the Northeast, with New York City alone recording more than 20,000 deaths, the bodies piling up in refrigerated trucks. The truth was, though, that the nightmare wasn't over. The country was not awake, and a new wave of cases was gathering with terrifying force. The US finds itself in a fight for its life, swamped by partisanship, mistrust of science, engulfed in mask wars, and led by a president whose incompetence is rivaled only by his indifference to American suffering. We know it wasn't just America. The pandemic's geopolitical aftershocks are coming, said the Atlantic press, and we know it's had an incredible impact around the world. What was interesting about this article on the 18th of May, and it's a really good one to read, because it basically says that the epidemiological challenges are possibly nothing compared to the economic, political, and military impacts that are going to potentially come out of this disease, and the way it's impacted economies, and the way borders have been closed, and so on. And they imagine a scenario where, in the chaos, and I'm reading this from the screen here, in the chaos, an autocrat eyes an opportunity for a land grab. Well, 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 that's interesting, isn't it? Because in the light of what we know from Ezekiel 38, there will be an autocrat who eyes an opportunity. We'll get onto that in a little bit, but huge destabilizing situation. So there's coronavirus, and there's the context perhaps of where it sort of comes in, with Trump launching these Middle East peace agreement and the map. But you know something? It didn't end there, because President Trump suddenly changed tack. And if you remember, in August of 2020, we suddenly heard something called the Abraham Accords. And we might wonder what these Abraham Accords were all about. Was this connected with the peace agreement that he had announced back in January? Well, actually, no. these were very, very different. President Trump had a complete change of heart and a complete change of tack, and launched these Abraham Accords in August. So what on earth were they, and why on earth did President Trump change tack? Well, to understand this, I've actually cut out a couple of little videos just to speed things up, but I think this Jerusalem Post article explains pretty much why Trump changed tack. So the headline in the Jerusalem Post, I think this was about the 13th of August. The headline was "How Trump Traded Annexation for His Christian Base." You see, Trump's idea was to annex a good chunk of the West Bank and give some of it to the Palestinians, and Israel was going to take other smaller parts of, or other parts of the West Bank. It was all sort of broken up and divvied up between Palestinians and Israel, according to his map. But he changed tack and gave up on this idea of annexing the West Bank. And as it says down here, it says, could the path to US President Donald Trump's re-election go through Dubai to the heart of his evangelical base in the American Bible Belt? Now, you have to remember that the 20% of America is evangelical, right? They are evangelical Christians. So it's a huge chunk of America, and they were heavily supporting President Trump the first time round, and he surrounded himself by these people, and many of them became his very closest advisors. And anyway, this article continues and says, one would have thought that the key to winning their support, these evangelical support, was annexing Judea and Samaria, the biblical heartland of the land of Israel. But sources in the evangelical community told the Jerusalem Post that they cared much more about bringing peace in the Middle East than changing the status of barren hilltops. So basically, the evangelicals said, forget about annexing the West Bank. Who cares about the West Bank? It's a few barren hilltops. What we think you should do is help Israel to make peace with its neighbors, and especially the Gulf Arab neighbors who they're sort of half related to. So what Trump listened to this, and what he then did, and this is on the White House website that you can actually go and look at right now. There is this thing called the Joint Statement of the United States, the State of Israel, and the United Arab Emirates. And the website says, as a result of this diplomatic breakthrough and at the request of President Trump and with the support of the UAE, Israel will suspend declaring sovereignty over areas outlined in the president's vision for peace. Israel agreed to not take sovereignty over any parts of the West Bank to make peace with Gulf Arab nations, the first one being the UAE. And here is a photograph of them outside the White House. So this is obviously Donald Trump. There's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. There's also the UAE leader there. And there is also the leader of Bahrain there, all signing this agreement. And as I say, this was predicated on Israel saying that they would not take any sovereignty over the West Bank. Now, I ask you, this is an actual copy of the Abraham Accords, which they all signed. And I would ask this question. They're called the Abraham Accords, but would Abraham sign them? Would Abraham sign an agreement that says, effectively, we will give up the right to the land that God has given us to make peace with these Arab nations? And you've only got to read Genesis 23, verses 10 to 13, to know that never, ever would Abraham sign any agreement and do any deals whatsoever when it came to the land that God had promised him. It's a travesty to even call them the Abraham Accords from that point of view. Clearly Trump did, because he sort of sees them, and rightly so, as half brothers, these Arab nations of Israel. But that doesn't make this deal the right deal at all. Just have a little listen to what Benjamin Netanyahu had to say about it.
This day is a pivot of history. It heralds a new dawn of peace. For thousands of years, the Jewish people have prayed for peace. For decades, the Jewish state has prayed for peace. And this is why today we're filled with such profound gratitude. I am grateful to you, President Trump, for your decisive leadership. You have unequivocally stood by Israel's side. You have boldly confronted the tyrants of Tehran. You've proposed a realistic vision for peace between Israel and the Palestinians. And you have successfully brokered the historic peace that we are signing today, a peace that has broad support in Israel, in America, in the Middle East, indeed in the entire world.
It's interesting. Here's a transcript of the first bit of that speech that we just listened to, and it's peace, 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 peace. Israel sees these deals as bringing peace. But, well, I don't necessarily believe that this is going to bring peace. I think the opposite is actually going to be the case, because you cannot deal with God's land and expect there to be peace. There's never been an instance ever in the scriptures where you can gamble with God's land and expect peace. In fact, of course, in 1 Thessalonians 5, we know that this is the case.
Chapter 5. Now, brothers and sisters, about times and dates, we do not need to write to you, for you know very well that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. While people are saying, peace and safety, destruction will come on them suddenly, as labor pains on a pregnant woman, and they will not escape. But you, brothers and sisters, are not in darkness, so that this day should surprise you like a thief.
But of course, the Gulf states are interesting, because the Gulf states crop up in Ezekiel 38. So they're part of this huge prophetical jigsaw puzzle. So even though I'm absolutely certain God is not happy at all with what Israel and certainly America pushing them to do this, I don't think God's at all happy. But of course, we know that the Gulf states are part of the story, because in Ezekiel 38, which we all know very well, is a prophecy about Russia coming down into Israel. And we're told there that there's a great army that comes down, that's Russia and Turkey and Iran, and there's some Northern African nations and so on. But in amongst all of that, we know that there is an opposing force to this Gogian invasion. And in verse 13, it says, Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish, with all the young lions thereof, will say to you, big opposing, huge force attacking Israel, have you come to take a spoil? And have you gathered your company to take a prey? So what you've got here is a group of nations called Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish and young lions. And so first on the list of this opposing force to Russia is Sheba and Dedan. And so obviously we know that whoever Sheba and Dedan are, they are pretty much on the side of Israel. They're certainly not fighting against Israel. They are on Israel's side. They're certainly not able to stop the conflict. They're not able to stop Russia and all of its allies invading Israel. We know that because Daniel 11 tells us that they sweep right through and conquer not only Israel, but also go right through into Egypt. But who are Sheba and Dedan that are allied to Israel? And the answer to that is Saudi Arabia is Sheba pretty much, and Dedan covers pretty much exactly the Gulf Arab states that have so far made agreements this year or last year with Israel. So there is the UAE there, you just about see it, and there's Bahrain. Those are the two little nations that have made peace with Israel effectively through the Abraham Accords. And the map on the right is an old sort of ancient map, which has got, you probably can't see it because I can't see it very well, but written on the map is where Dedan was, which pretty much covers exactly where the UAE is right now. So we know that these things are written about. And so this coming together of what we would call the King of the South is very, very significant. It doesn't make it right from a godly point of view, but it's coming together all the same. So what do we read in relation to this? So, well, in the Times on September the 16th, Trump hails Gulf's shift on Israel as the dawn of a new Middle East. President Trump heralded the dawn of a new Middle East yesterday and predicted that Saudi Arabia and half a dozen other countries would follow the UAE and Bahrain as they formally recognized Israel. So Saudi Arabia hasn't as yet sort of joined in with the others, but there's probably a high likelihood that they might, because Sheba and Dedan encompasses Saudi Arabia as well. Israel and the UAE strike oil pipeline deal. The UAE has signed a deal to send oil directly to the Mediterranean through an Israeli pipeline, the biggest result yet from the normalization of relations between the countries. Pipelines across the Middle East to the giant European markets have been a geopolitical flashpoint since the Second World War. So we see Israel now straight away, within days, doing economic deals. I mean, this is great for Israel from a wealth point of view, from a prosperity point of view, and they think it's great from a peace point of view. But all of these things are not leading to peace. We know that. There is great trouble coming on Israel. That is an absolute fact. But we do know that Israel has got something that Russia wants. And the fact that we've already read this in Ezekiel 38, that Israel has got riches and has got something to plunder, has got spoils that Russia wants. Well, there's nothing more than Russia wants than oil. And here is Israel now, not only finding gas and oil in recent years, but now doing these very wealthy deals with its newfound friends. Which brings us on to think about, how does all this impact Iran? Because Iran and Saudi Arabia are arch enemies. Iran is Shia Muslim and Saudi Arabia is Sunni Muslim, and they really are absolutely sworn enemies. And the fact that Israel is now making overtures and making friends with the Gulf Arab nations is seriously winding Iran up to a huge amount. And of course, not only that, you've got Iran and the whole Trump versus Biden situation going on, where under Trump, Iran has been very much sidelined, and pretty much America has torn up the agreement with Iran. And the whole thing's very, very destabilized with Iran right now, which we're going to look at right now. This was, again, in the Atlantic, a news organization. Iran and the Palestinians lose out in the Abraham Accords. So they were definite losers in Trump's deal with Israel and these Gulf Arab nations. So on the, this goes right back a year ago, and I think we did cover this. This is one of the things I did cover at the review of 2019 when we got together last year. If you remember, exactly a year ago, President Trump ordered the killing of one of the top military commanders of Iran. There was an assassination. And since then, since January last year, things have gone downhill very quickly with Iran. Iran, just a few days later, on January the 7th, launched missiles at US military facilities in Iraq. You probably remember that. So last year got off to a very, very shaky start with Iran. Iran said the total annihilation of Israel will be the price for the Soleimani killing. Associated Press on May the 22nd, Iran leader says Israel is a cankerous tumor to be destroyed. The Times on November the 28th, Iran's nuclear mastermind shot dead by assassins near Tehran. So now we've had another significant person within Iran being killed. This time they're pretty much their head, well, he was the head of their nuclear program, was killed actually in Tehran itself. And all this is increasing tension. So the Abraham Accords increased tension, and now we've also got all of these assassinations increasing tension as well. This is Newsweek on December the 4th. Iran vows revenge for scientist assassination as Israel braces for possible terror attacks. A year after Soleimani's assassination, Iran and the US edged closer to conflict. That was in The Independent just a couple of days ago. The anniversary and ongoing, sorry, not ongoing, he wishes he was ongoing. The anniversary of an outgoing US president with little to lose could prove a tipping point for tensions between Tehran and Washington. And there's great concern as we sit here right now that in the dying days of President Trump's presidency, he might well do pretty much spectacular things. He might, you know, try and launch some sort of conflict, do anything he can to stay in power. And he still has got full ability to do that, even up until the 20th of January. But what does the Bible say about all of this? What does the Bible say about Iran? Well, we know Persia in Ezekiel 38 allies itself to Russia, but has Iran got any role to play before Russia comes down? And I actually think it has. So let's just have a look and listen to this. This is taken from Isaiah chapter 21.
Chapter 21. A prophecy against the desert by the sea. Like whirlwinds sweeping through the southland, an invader comes from the desert, from a land of terror. A dire vision has been shown to me. The traitor betrays, the looter takes loot. Elam, attack. Media, lay siege. I will bring to an end all the groaning she caused. At this, my body is racked with pain. Pangs seize me like those of a woman in labor. I am staggered by what I hear. I am bewildered by what I see.
Now, this isn't taken out of context. Isaiah 21 is one of the chapters of a sequence of chapters that talks about burdens. There's burdens of different nations. There's the burden of Iraq, there's the burden of Egypt, there's the burden of Damascus and Syria. And all of these, when you look at them, there's 9 or 10 of them in Isaiah, starting at Isaiah 13, going all the way up to Isaiah 23. And they're all national nightmares that the world can't cope with. And one of them is this. It is this prophecy against the desert by the sea. And it doesn't say where the sea is, it's the desert by the sea. But actually, we are told pretty much where it is, because there's 2 place names given to us in this vision that Isaiah had. One is Elam, and the other is Media. And Elam is told to attack, and Media is told to lay siege or besiege. So where was Elam and where was Media, and where is the sea, if there is one, that's next to them? Well, here's a map showing you exactly where Elam was and exactly where Media or the Medes were. And you notice that Elam backs right up against the Persian Gulf, which is exactly where we've got all of these difficulties. And on the left of the Persian Gulf in this area that's entitled Arabs is Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia and Iran face each other across this sea. And on both sides of this sea is desert. So what we're being told in Ezekiel 21 is that Elam is going to rise up and the Medes are going to besiege, and it's going to be one of the burdens of the world. Now, it just so happens that 20% of the whole world's oil supply goes through the Persian Gulf. And you'll see in a second, there's some very interesting headlines in relation to this area. So on November the 25th in the Times, this was the headline: Trump sends B-52s to the Gulf in final show of strength with Iran. The US has sent long-range bomber force to the Middle East at short notice over the weekend as leading American, Israeli and Saudi officials held an unprecedented diplomatic meeting on Saudi Arabia's Red Sea coast. When you read about America and Saudi Arabia coming together, you're reading there about the King of the South all coming together to meet. And the B-52s, which are America's largest bombers that can carry nuclear weapons, have been deployed, it says, to deter Iran. These are unprecedented diplomatic exchanges. And bearing in mind, this isn't even 2 months old, this news. This is a month and a half ago. On December the 22nd in the Times, US submarine surfaces in the Gulf, in this very area that God tells us to look at, as a warning to Iran. An American submarine armed with 154 Tomahawk land attack cruise missiles has been ordered to surface in the Gulf in a show of strength amid tensions with Iran. To underline the message, the US Navy published a photograph of USS Georgia and a Hawaii-class submarine as it went through the narrow Strait of Hormuz into where? Well, the Persian Gulf. This was the Associated Press on December the 15th. With an eye on Iran, Israel tests missile defense system. The whole region is very, very wary at this time about what Iran might do at this anniversary of the killing of its top military commander and with the recent assassination of its nuclear chief. Tehran flexes Palestinian muscle with Gaza rocket exercise out to sea. That was just literally a few days ago. And here is, you can watch Israel successfully test firing this system to combat the threats from Iran.
The newly developed multi-tiered missile defense system in a drill carried out over the sea. The IDF reports that all targets were destroyed, simulating incoming rockets, ballistic missiles, and drones. Our defense correspondent Jonathan Regev joined us earlier in studio with more details.
The assumption in Israel is that a future war could include not one and not even two arenas, but maybe even more. There's a threat from the Gaza Strip, a threat from Lebanon through Hezbollah, a threat from Syria through Iranian proxies, and then the threat from Iran itself, maybe even Yemen with the Houthis, also Iranian proxies. And all of these threats can come to Israel at once. It may happen. Let's hope it doesn't, but it may happen. Israel has to be ready for the possibility that...
You know something? What he just listed out is exactly the nations of Psalm 83. You see, what we've said before, and I stick totally by this, is that there is going to be an initial inner ring or inner circle war that comes against Israel before Gog comes down. And all of the nations that are listed, or they're not really nations, all of the tribes that are listed out in Psalm 83 are all of them that surround, as pricking briars, we might say, the little land of Israel. And what that military analyst just said was that Israel's preparing for conflict on all of its borders, from Syria, from Hezbollah, from Hamas, and from Iran. And one of the interesting things is in Psalm 83, you've got all of those tribes that are mentioned, but it says there they're supported by, or they're backed by Assur, A-S-S-U-R. And Assur, I believe, is talking about Iran, because when you look at where Assur used to be at the time when Psalm 83 was written, it covered a good proportion of modern day Iran. So in other words, all these people that surround Israel, that hate Israel and want Israel to be destroyed, are backed by a much bigger power behind the scenes. And this is, well, I believe, on the cards clearly at some point, and maybe we're reaching that time even as we speak. So what about Russia? How does Russia fit into all this? Because we know that at some point Russia is going to come down. Let's just have a listen to some words from Ezekiel 38.
Get ready, be prepared, you and all the hordes gathered about you, and take command of them. After many days you will be called to arms. In future years you will invade a land that has recovered from war, whose people were gathered from many nations to the mountains of Israel, which had long been desolate. They had been brought out from the nations, and now all of them live in safety. You and all your troops and the many nations with you will go up, advancing like a storm. You will be like a cloud covering the land.
Interesting thing there, it says you will invade a land that's recovered from war. Some translations say recovering from war. And I actually wonder if the recovering from war isn't about the conflicts that might have taken that have happened over the 2 millennia before Israel was recreated. I actually think that the recovering or recovered from war situation is when the pricking briars of Ezekiel have been actually removed. In other words, when Zechariah 12 has happened. In other words, when the surrounding peoples, where the peoples round about, as Zechariah 12 says, have been completely removed. And at that point, Israel will live in what it believes is security and safety, because it's actually removed all the pricking briars, those who are attacking them with rockets, i.e. Hamas and Hezbollah, and so on. And it's at this point when Israel thinks it's finally sorted out its long-term problems, that's when Russia comes down. I think Jesus comes back quite a long time before that, to be fair. But that's another story. But the key bit for me on this slide here is Russia is being told, or Putin, who's Gog, get ready, be prepared, you and all the hordes gathered about you. In other words, the preparation of Russia is something that goes on for some time. It isn't that Putin wakes up on one day and says, oh, let's go and invade Israel. There's a preparation for conflict. And that's why these headlines are interesting. So Putin and Saudi prince in global battle for oil supremacy. So straight away here, we've got Putin, who is currently Gog, and Saudi Arabia, which is king of the south. So this in Bible language is king of the north and king of the south in global battle for oil supremacy. That's exactly what we would expect to see, Putin wanting to control oil. Putin grabs power in Russia for a further 16 years. That happened on the 11th of March. Russia is the world's biggest loser from oil's crash, and that's reason to worry, said Market Watch on April the 24th. This is quite interesting because Russia is in economic difficulty, to say the least. Russia's challenge now is to avoid collapse, this article said. The Russian budget is distributed among its constituent regions, which pay the teachers and doctors and firemen. But with the decline of energy prices, Russia's budget declines, and it declines, the regions contract. Now, the reason that's interesting is because Brother John Thomas in 1849 said these amazing words. He said, let the Russian treasury be as empty as it is said to be, and its expenditure exceed its revenue by double the alleged deficit. In other words, let Russia be penniless or bankrupt. It will only operate as a pressure from within causing her autocrat, Gog, to enter into the countries and to overflow and pass over. He's quoting Daniel 11, verse 40 there, and to enrich himself with the spoil of those he is destined to subdue. In other words, he's quoting Ezekiel 38 there, which talks about Russia coming down and taking a spoil. So he says in the last days, Russia's going to be bankrupt, and that will cause Russia to want to take a spoil from Israel. And that's exactly what we're seeing happening. Not only that, Putin's ordering military drills for 150,000 troops. That was on the 17th of July, with 27,000 military vehicles involved and 414 aircraft and 106 Navy ships. August the 7th, Russia warns it will see any incoming missiles as nuclear. This is obviously pushing the rhetoric up. Russian military is the strongest since the Cold War. Experts issue worrying nuclear weapons warnings. So Russia isn't the basket case it once was back in the late 90s. It's now armed to the teeth. Russia's unprecedentedly expansive military exercises. That was on October the 20th. Vladimir Putin's navy to create Russian Red Sea base in Sudan. Sudan, by the way, is ancient Kush, which is translated as Ethiopia in Ezekiel chapter 38, but it's much better translated as Sudan, not Ethiopia. And here is Putin creating a navy and a base in that very country that Ezekiel 38 talks about. Putin orders a new nuclear-proof command center. That was November the 18th. Why is he doing that? Why is Putin ordering a new nuclear-proof command center? It's because he knows what is going to come. He knows, and what he's preparing for is huge conflict. Russia conducts drill of its strategic nuclear forces. That was on December the 9th. And here's a little video of a birthday present that Putin had just a few months ago.
Russia has test launched a hypersonic cruise missile and successfully hit a target in the Barents Sea. That was the news given by a senior commander to Vladimir Putin on Wednesday, his 68th birthday.
Добрый день, Валерий Алексеевич.
Speaking to Putin by video link, Valery Gerasimov, chief of the Army's General Staff, said the test strike on Tuesday was carried out from the Admiral Gorshkov vessel in the White Sea in northern Russia.
Работа над системой Циркон.
Putin said the test is a big event not only for the military, but for Russia as a whole. And he said arming Russia's military with the newest weapon systems will ensure the defence capabilities of Russia in the long term. Gerasimov said the Zircon hypersonic cruise missile hit its target at a distance of 450 kilometres in just 4.5 minutes. It reached hypersonic speeds of more than 8 times the speed of sound. The test comes amid tensions over arms controls between Russia and the United States. Russia now have got this hypersonic missile, and as it just says, it goes 8 times the speed of sound. There's no other military, there's no country on earth that's got anything like this. It's absolutely unbelievable, these speeds that it can go, and Putin boasts that nothing can shoot it down, and it can carry multiple nuclear weapons. This particular hypersonic missile can go 20 times the speed of sound. It's beyond almost belief, and carrying such death and destruction with them. So the last little bit I was just going to mention is around Brexit. I think we're absolutely certain that Russia is preparing. And on top of everything else, if there wasn't enough to be thinking about, here we've got Britain finally leaving the EU. It's just incredible that all these things are coming together at the same time. Brexit deal is finally done. Boris Johnson announced on, I think that was Christmas Eve when he actually announced that. Britain and the EU have struck a Brexit deal that would define their relationship for decades to come. We've taken back control of our destiny, he said. So Britain has left the EU. We know technically it did on January the 31st last year, 2020,
but this is now the divorce deal, if you like. This is now how we're going to be able to move ahead. When I say we, I shouldn't say we, because we're just, we're resident foreigners. We live in Britain, but this is not our country. We're strangers and pilgrims watching on. But the reason, of course, that we're interested in this is, once again, John Thomas, back in 1849, in Elpis, Israel, said these amazing words. When you think he wrote it 150 or so years ago, when I come to unfold these things, the reader will see why Britain is not included in the 10 toes. The 10 toes, just to explain, clearly the EU did not exist when in 1849. Of course it didn't, not in the way that it does now. But the 10 toes, John Thomas correctly saw as being European mainland. And what he basically says is that Britain is not included in the 10 toes in European mainland. She is reserved of God to antagonize Russia. The 10 toes belong to the image as a united dominion. Hence, Britain cannot be included among them. And this is why Christadelphians, for uniquely, out of all religions on the planet, identify correctly that Britain is Tarshish, and correctly that Britain would come out of the EU or mainland Europe. And that's exactly what we've suddenly seen happen at the very time all these other things are happening as well. The UK and Israel have signed a military cooperation agreement. So this is Tarshish, the UK, siding with Israel to some extent. But as we know, the power of the West, the power of Tarshish and the Young Lions is going to drain away. And we're certainly starting to see that happen. So Britain is not going to be able to defend Israel properly when Russia comes down. Post-Brexit, UK announces largest military spending since the Cold War. So despite the fact that we're pretty much bankrupt, Boris Johnson wants us to almost become a superpower again. It isn't going to happen. We're not going to be able to counteract the forces that come against Israel. One of the interesting things is, I've nearly finished, you'll be glad to know, but one of the interesting things is that with Britain sort of wrenching itself out of the EU has led to a number of nations saying, well, actually, we need to rethink the whole EU plan. Portugal's Prime Minister has called for a smaller European Union of values after Brexit, with other countries frozen out of future integration because they do not accept debt transfers, migrant quotas, or demands over the rule of law. So in other words, it is call for Europe to become a much smaller organization, or the EU to become smaller. And in fact, the Pope said on April the 13th, the future of Europe is hanging in the balance. The Pope warns coronavirus poses a risk so great that it could mark the end of the EU if mishandled, the Pope warned yesterday in his Easter address. Europe was facing an epochal challenge on which would depend not only its future, but that of the whole world. And of course, you know, that's another impact of coronavirus. And we know with Bible in hand that there is going to rise out of the bloated EU 10 nations that will form a latter-day Holy Roman Empire, but that's a whole other subject. So just to conclude, really, you know, starting where we finished, we've got the world clinging to this little bottle of hope, this vaccine that will make all the troubles go away. But we know for certain that this is not the case. We know for certain that the contractions are underway. And you know something? It's not just looking at the politics. It's not just looking at how nations are behaving. It's not just looking at the turmoil in America or how coronavirus has impacted. We've also got physical things happening in the world at the same time.
2020 shattering records around the world for some of the wildest weather ever recorded.
Deadly wildfires raging up and down the West Coast. Go, go, go.
More than 10 million acres charred, mostly in California, Colorado, and the Pacific Northwest.
What's happening with fires in the West right now is exactly what has been predicted with climate change. The atmosphere is hotter and drier.
Hey, time to move the hose line up.
Fire crews battling walls of flames.
I've been covering fires for half a dozen years or more. I've never seen anything like this. The sky completely orange.
This is the strongest hurricane to hit this part of the Gulf Coast in history.
The amount of damage around Lake Charles is just incredible. Some of the winds from Hurricane Laura took upper floors of this hotel and ripped it to shreds.
30 named storms in the Atlantic, the most in history.
We could spend all evening watching unbelievable signs, but perhaps we should pretty much finish with these words from Acts chapter 2, which we know have got absolute fulfillment in the very last days.
In the last days, God says, I will pour out my Spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. Your young men will see visions. Your old men will dream dreams. Even on my servants, both men and women, I will pour out my Spirit in those days, and they will prophesy. I will show wonders in the heavens above and signs on the earth below, blood and fire and billows of smoke. The sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the coming of the great and glorious day of the Lord, and everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved.
So there we are. That was a look back at 2020 with so much happening. Even as we sat here right now, I've got stuff coming through on my phone saying, you know, there's turmoil going on US Capitol grounds. There's an explosive device being found. Somebody's been shot. You know, this is democracy in all sorts of trouble. And it's all come on the back, I believe, of Trump messing about with Israel and trying to divide Jerusalem and trying to divide the land. And we're seeing the great weakening of America and Britain for that to that extent. What comes next? Well, you know, we shouldn't predict, but I think we can certainly say the contractions are going to continue. And who knows when the inner ring war, which I believe is next on the agenda to happen, a conflict around Israel from its immediate neighbors and Iran being the power behind that throne, that could happen at any time. I know I've gone on a bit, but I thank you very much for listening. Hopefully there was some helpful things in there and you might agree with some of the conclusions that I've made, but I will now hand back to Phil. I'll stop sharing my screen.